Good evening. Welcome to our Wednesday night Bible study as we continue through the book of Psalms. I hope that you're doing well and that you're excited to be joining us tonight via video. Hope you'll join afterwards for our prayer service on Zoom. If you're not a regular person who gets my emails and would like to join, please do drop me an email and we'll get you added onto that. We're going to study Psalm 108 today, a little bit shorter of a psalm, but lots to dive into and think about here this evening. Let me read it to begin as we study Psalm 108, a song, a psalm of David. My heart is steadfast, O God. I will sing and make melody with all my being. Awake, O harp and lyre. I will awake the dawn. I will give thanks to you, O Lord, among the peoples. I will sing praises to you among the nations, for your steadfast love is great above the heavens. Your faithfulness reaches to the clouds. Be exalted, O God, above the heavens. Let your glory be over all the earth. That your beloved ones may be delivered. Give salvation by your right hand and answer me. God has promised in his holiness. With exaltation I will divide up Shechem and portion out the valley of Succoth. Gilead is mine, Manasseh is mine, Ephraim is my helmet, Judah is my scepter, Moab is my wash basin. Upon Edom I cast my shoe. Over Philistia I shout in triumph. Who will bring me to the fortified city? Who will lead me to Edom? Have you not rejected us, O God? You do not go out, O God, with our armies. O grant us help against the foe, for vain is the salvation of man. With God we shall do valiantly. It is he who will tread down our foes. All right, so we're going to take our questions here and look at those and answer these 20 different questions that we answer every week of every psalm that we have studied. So the first question, who wrote the psalm? Obviously, we see in the title that it says David. It always is nice when we see that title, or the author included in the title. To whom did the author write this psalm? Well, this psalm is mostly written directed, I would argue all of it's directed towards God, although throughout in the middle of the psalm, David declares what God had promised. Okay, and we'll talk about that in a little bit when we ask that question. But this is directed towards God. Okay, when did the author write this? Well, it would appear as though this was written before a battle with Edom, just because Edom is mentioned again in the end of this. You know, he lists a lot of cities, a lot of territories, but then he says in verse 10, who will lead me to the fortified city? Who will lead me to Edom? And so most people believe this is likely before a battle with Edom. We're not exactly sure on that. What's also interesting is that this psalm is identical to verses 1 through 5 of this psalm is identical to verses 7 through 11 of Psalm 57. And then verses 6 through 13 of this psalm, so the rest of the psalm, is almost identical to Psalm 60, verses 5 through 12. And so it appears that this is a kind of a combination of those two psalms. So we even see in those psalms that Moab, Edom, and Philistia are mentioned with emphasis on Edom here. Okay? So we don't really know, but because we also see that early on in his campaign, that David had defeated Edom, but it's possible that they raised up again against him and we don't have that recorded, and so that's the likely situation going on. Why did the psalmist write this psalm? Well, it would appear that the psalmist is writing this to ask God for help through both praising God and then also even kind of implying that God had turned his back on Israel. Now, I think what we could argue here is that maybe Edom's rise again against Israel was David's viewpoint of why God had stopped helping Israel. Or it's possible that Israel had faced a few defeats and leading up into this battle, and that's why David said what he did later on in the chapter, which again we'll look at in just a few minutes. So, but it's clear, in answer to question number 4, it is clear that David is writing for God's help. Even through the praise, it is about looking forward to God's help. Okay? Are there any repeated words or phrases? Well, We have God repeated 6 times. Obviously, in a psalm that is asking for God's help, it makes sense. Um, Salvation's repeated a couple times, Edom repeated a couple times, so all of those things kind of make sense with what the psalm is talking about. Question number 6. What questions are being asked? We see 3 questions in this psalm, all lumped together in verses 10 and 11. Who will bring me to the fortified city? Who will lead me to Edom? Now, both of those questions in verse 10, obviously, as we look at question number 7, what answers are given, obviously he is asking for God's help in saying that. It's kind of an understood question, a rhetorical question, with the answer being God. Now, in verse 11, he asks another question. Have you not rejected us, O God? You do not go out, O God, with our enemies. So, I think you could argue that the question there is, God, why did you reject us? Or have you rejected us? But in the way it's stated, it's like, God, you rejected us, right? So why? And so that is an interesting thing. Okay? And so the answer to that verse 11 question, I think, is that idea that David is implying that he felt as though God did reject him. Whether or not that was actually the case, David's equating defeat with God's rejection, which we know that God, through times of Israel's sin, God would cause or allow defeat of Israel for a specific purpose, to turn them back to him. And so that could be what we're talking about here. Question number 8. What commands or requests are given? Well, we see in verse 2, awake, O harp and lyre, I will awake the dawn. Obviously, that's not a request saying, okay, harp, get to playing yourself. But the idea is that he's basically saying to himself, get busy praising God. We see in verse 5, be exalted, O God, above the heavens. Let your glory be over all the earth. Now, this is a request to God, that God would be exalted, that God would let his glory be over all the earth. And I think what we can see, as we see later on, that David is believing that it is through God's work on Israel's behalf that will happen. And so he's saying, God, I want you to show yourself strong. I want you to show your glory. And he says, here's how you can do that, God. Now we see that Moses did the same thing and called out for God. I think that we can do the same thing. We have to make sure, though, that our motives are pure, by the way, when we ask something like that. Sometimes we're very selfish and we say, God, I just want you to get the glory, so heal me. When in reality, it's more about our comfort. And I think that goes back to James's point. The reasons we don't have is because we ask amiss. And sometimes we don't ask for the right reasons. And our requests are very self-motivated rather than God-motivated. But here David says, God, I want you to get the glory. We see verse 6. That your beloved ones may be delivered, and give salvation by your right hand, and answer me. So David again says, God, I want you to answer me. What I'm asking for you to do is to deliver your beloved ones, your chosen ones, Israel, from their enemies. Verse 12, O grant us help against the foe, for vain is the salvation of man. Again, David asking for God's help. Now this goes back to our theme, why we believe that, or can clearly see that the theme is, or why did the author write this psalm? Verse 4. The reason he wrote it is to ask for God's help. Okay, no doubt about it. All right, question number 9. What warnings are given? Verse 7 says, God has promised in his holiness, with exaltation I will divide up Shechem and portion out the valley of Succoth. Now, this is not necessarily a warning. However, I think the warning is that this is God's land, okay? And really, those center verses there really reference that idea that this is God's land. God is going to divide out his promised land to Israel. And if you're in that territory, be warned of that. All right, question number 10. What comparisons are given? I don't see any comparisons. Don't have any similes, metaphors. Verse number 11. What contrasts are given? Well, it's interesting. In the end of verse 12 and the beginning of verse 13, we see a great contrast and one that we need to remember. For vain is the salvation of man, with God we shall do valiantly. If there's a contrast that we need to learn from this psalm, I think that's it. Our strength by itself is worthless. God is the one who delivers. It is God. And so that reminder is tremendous and important for us to remember. Okay? Now, we see question number 12. We're going to spend some time thinking about this. And I've also got a little map for you to see. I'll put that up, and you can see that map as we read this. But we see some illustrations of how it is that God is going to show himself strong, and how it is that God will prove that he will, in fact, provide deliverance and victory for Israel through these verses. Okay, and because of these verses, I should say. So verse 7 says, God has promised in his holiness, with exaltation I will divide up Shechem and portion out the valley of Succoth. Now, what's interesting, we're going to read this again in verse 14. We'll talk about it then more. But what's interesting is we don't see that actually recorded anywhere. Well, besides the other psalm that it's mentioned in. So it is interesting that it's in quotes in our Bible. So it's possible that this was an oracle that was passed down from that was known to the Israelites that just wasn't recorded in Scripture. You can see the connection with the Promised Land, but it is interesting that David's looking at it as more of a true quote, and we don't see that recorded anywhere in the Old Testament. But when we look at these verses specifically, Shechem and Succoth is Shechem a city, Succoth a region, the valley of Succoth, and God said basically, this is mine. I'm going to divide it out among my people, and I'm going to be sovereign over it, and we know that's how God was over Israel. Verse 8 says, Gilead is mine, Manasseh is mine, Ephraim is my helmet, Judah my scepter. Now, a little bit of a metaphor there, so I guess I'm contradicting what I just said, but I wanted to talk about it here in this illustration point because they do overlap. But the regions of Israel, and we'll see our map here, Gilead and Manasseh on the east side of the Jordan River, the central sections of Judah and Ephraim, they were all under God's control, God's dominion. When he says Ephraim is my helmet, it's because Ephraim was Ephraim, a descendant of Joseph. If you remember, Joseph got a double portion, if you will. And so Ephraim became one of the most prominent tribes of Israel, and one of the most populous tribes in the northern tribes. And so therefore Ephraim many times is or the northern tribes are kind of referenced together as Ephraim. And so just like the southern tribes, Judah. And so that same idea. And so that idea of Ephraim like a helmet expressing God's strength, God's security. But then when he says, Judah my scepter, obviously we know a scepter is that thing that the king holds on to show his sovereign control. And obviously we know Judah became the tribe of David, tribe of Jesus. Obviously a very important ruling tribe, if you will. Okay? Moab is my wash basin. Upon Edom I cast my shoe. Over Philistia I shout in triumph. You see these again on our map. Well, these are all the outlying areas, not part of Israel, but the border surrounding Israel. And so Moab is my wash basin. Basically, God's saying, I'm still in charge of Moab. God's going to use it however he desired. And sometimes we see God use Moab to punish Israel. Sometimes it was, and here we see the illustration, the metaphor of a pot for washing feet. I mean, so something very low. So very interesting. David did conquer Moab, by the way. We said that earlier, 2 Samuel 8 talks about that. He defeated Moab, and he measured them with a line, making them to lie down on the ground. 2 lines he measured to be put to death, 1 full line to be spared. And the Moabites became servants to David and brought tribute. And so here we see that that was part of this region that David conquered. That's why we think maybe this was later on in David's life that David was asking for prayer for them. Then he says in that same verse, verse 9, upon Edom I will cast my shoe. Now we seen, wasn't it President Bush, I believe it was, that had a shoe thrown at him in the Middle East. And that's kind of like, if you remember that whole episode, I believe that's what it was. Maybe my memory's foggy on that, but I think that's what it was. Or somebody in his party anyway. But the idea with that is that this was kind of the lowest insult. In a day where you're walking with your shoe and out in the muddy areas, your feet would become nasty. And I still I don't want someone to throw a shoe at me, but it was a very, very low insult at that point in time. But that's the idea, that God said, if I want to do that to Edom, I'm sovereign king, I can do that. And that was kind of that idea. Over Philistia, I will triumph, he says in that verse. So again, this idea, a longtime enemy of Israel, Philistia, God says, I'm going to defeat them. I'm going to conquer them. So all these illustrations are illustrative. All these cities, all these regions are illustrative of how God has promised to defend, protect Israel. That's the point of this, to remind us of God's promise to Israel for protection. And that's what David is calling back on. And are these all the Psalms, or all the promises, of God protecting Israel? No, but these are the ones that are illustrative of that David calls back to remembrance. Okay? Question 13. What causes and effects and reasons for doing things are used? So we see a few things here, and some of them are effects and then the cause, and then some are cause and effect. But first off, we see in verse 1 and through 3, we see an effect. My heart is steadfast, O God. I will sing and make melody with all my being. Awake, O harp and lyre. I will awake the dawn. I will give thanks to you, O Lord, among the peoples. I will sing your praise to you among the nations. Why is all that? What's the cause for all of that praise? What's the cause for those thanks that David says I'm going to do? Why do I need to get my harp and my lyre out? Well, verse 4. For your steadfast love is great above the heavens. Your faithfulness reaches the clouds. Folks, it's true for us today. Our thankfulness should be towards God because of his steadfast love, because of his faithfulness. That's how it should work. Okay? We see in verse 5 a cause. Be exalted, O God, above the heavens. Let your glory be over all the earth. That's the cause, God's glory being shown. What's the effect of that? That your beloved ones may be delivered. Give salvation by your right hand and answer me. Now, I think you can reverse these two as well, and see that it is because of God's delivering his beloved ones. I think this is David's argument. Because of that, God's glory will be shown throughout all the earth. Now, I think you could also look the other way. God will, because God is exalted, the effect of that would be all of the people in his family and the people of Israel would be delivered, and so cause and effect double there. Okay, and then a reason for doing things we see in verse 12. Oh, grant us help against the foe. The reason for that, for vain is the salvation of man. We can't do it on our own. And so the psalmist says, I need your help, God. Our work is vain. We can't do anything here. We need you. And so I think that's interesting as well. Number 14. What promises are given? Verse 1 says, my heart is steadfast, O God. I will sing and make melody with all my being. What a promise that David makes to God. God, I'm going to be steadfast. I'm going to be hold firm. I'm not going to be shaken. I'm not going to worry. I'm not going to wander. I will sing melody with all my being. I'm going to do that, David promises. We see in verse 3, I will give thanks to you, O God, among all the peoples. I will sing praises to you among the nations. God, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to declare your goodness. We see in verse 7, I talked about this with the promise. We see this promise that David refers to that we don't see necessarily recorded from, but that verse 7 where he talks about all those different regions. And we won't look at that again, but we just looked at that. Okay? So those are promises both from David to God and that David recalls that God made to Israel. Question number 15, what advice, admonitions, or attitudes are given? I didn't see anything there. Question number 16, what paradoxes or hyperboles are used? I think it's a little bit of a paradox in question number 11. Have you not rejected us, O God? You do not go out, O God, with our armies. So that's his first statement. But then he says in verse 12, O grant us help against the foe, for vain is the salvation of man. Now to me that's a contradiction. Where David says, God, you're not going out for us, and then he says, oh God, your going out for us is going to help us. Now, how do we rectify that? Well, I think the idea is that David is saying, okay, God, in our last battle, and again, because we don't know exactly when this happened, we can't reference back to it. But I think the point is God, you didn't go out and help us in the last battle. We need your help. It is only by your help we're going to win. We are acknowledging that. So God, whatever it caused us to not have your help over here, we need your help now. And so I think that's what we can see from that. Okay? Question number 17. What is the tone of the psalm? Well, this is definitely a plea and a praise to God. This is both praising God mixed in with a plea to God. And a great reminder that I think that's how we should pray. Our pleas to God should be bathed in much praise for God because of who he is. And what a reminder this psalm is for that. Is there anything unusual you found unusual or unexpected? Yeah, and I just mentioned that in verse 11 and 12. Have you rejected us, O God? You do not go out, God, with our enemies. O grant us help against the foe, for vain is the salvation of man. That whole idea is interesting to me. Unusual to see that in the midst of this psalm that's really declaring that God is going to, and God has promised to help them. And then for David also say right in the middle of that, or right at the end of that, but God, you're not going out for us. It is unusual to me. Question number 19. What do you learn about God from the psalm? Well, his steadfast love. It's a great promise. It is he who delivers us. It is he who provides us the victory. We are completely dependent upon him. If we as believers would understand our dependence upon God, it would make our faith more real, more necessary for daily living. It would make us run to him. It really would. That dependence upon him is increased as we understand that we have to depend upon him. I mean, that just makes sense. As you think about any area of your life, if you become dependent upon something, the more you realize that you're dependent upon something, the more you become dependent upon that person. Well, in some cases, that's a bad thing. But in the case of God, we have to understand that our dependence must be upon him. And we have to grasp that. So what lesson did you learn from this psalm? Question number 20. Well, we are powerless without God. Completely powerless. And our hearts can be steadfast because of the steadfast love of God. I don't know if you've caught that in this psalm, but it talks both about the steadfast love of God and our hearts being steadfast. Interesting. It's possible for us to be steadfast because of God's steadfast love for us. And I hope that's what you'll find as you depend upon him, recognizing the steadfast love, that you become steadfast, unmovable, because of God. Not because you're a great human being, not because that you have you have great faith, not because of anything about you, but instead because of God. You become steadfast in him. All right? All right. Talk to you a little bit on Zoom.